She was once one of the most recognizable child stars on television, loved by millions every week. But behind the bright screen and the perfect image, something much darker was unfolding in the background. As the fame faded, the life she built inside Hollywood began to fall apart in ways few people ever saw coming. What really happened after the cameras stopped rolling has left many still asking questions today. Join us as we uncover the untold story behind the rise and tragic fall of Family Affair star Anissa Jones, a childhood before fame. Mary Anissa Jones was born in 1958 in West Lafayette, Indiana, into a family that, on the surface, looked stable and promising. Her father, John Paul Jones, worked as a NASA engineer, a job that placed him in a highly respected and demanding field during a time when space exploration was a major national focus. Her mother, Mary Paula Jones, stayed closely involved in family life and the upbringing of their children. From the beginning, Anissa grew up in a home where intelligence, discipline, and achievement were valued very highly. Not long after her birth, the family moved to California because of her father's work. This move turned out to be important for what would later happen in Anissa's life. California in the 1960s was not only growing fast, but it was also becoming a central place for television, advertising, and film production. Many families who moved there for jobs or lifestyle reasons found themselves much closer to the entertainment industry than they ever expected. As a child, Anissa was described as lively, expressive, and very comfortable in social settings. She had a natural energy that made her stand out in everyday situations. People around her often noticed that she seemed aware of cameras and attention even at a young age. This did not mean she was performing for others all the time, but she showed a kind of ease in front of adults and strangers that made her noticeable. These early traits would later become important when casting directors began looking for child actors with natural, unforced behavior. Inside her home, there was also a strong emphasis on doing well. Being a gifted child was not just an informal label, it carried expectations. Academic performance, manners, and behavior were all closely guided. While this structure helped provide stability, it also placed pressure on children to meet high standards from an early age. For Anissa, this meant growing up with the idea that success and approval were tied closely to performance, whether in school, social behavior, or later in public appearances. At the same time, there were quieter signs that the family environment was not completely simple. Like many households under stress from work demands and daily responsibilities, there were periods of emotional distance and tension between parents. These moments were not unusual for families of the time, but they still shaped the emotional atmosphere in which Anissa was raised. Children often absorb these dynamics even when they are not directly involved in them. As the family settled into California life, Anissa's entry into modeling and small commercial work began at a young age. This was not uncommon in the region, where agencies regularly looked for children in suburban neighborhoods. Her natural appearance and expressive personality made her a good fit for print ads and early television commercials. These small jobs were often presented as harmless or even fun opportunities, and they introduced her to professional sets, photographers, and casting routines before she reached her teenage years. During the 1960s, Hollywood scouts and talent agents frequently searched suburban California areas for children who fit specific all-American looks. Schools, community events, and local advertisements became informal recruitment spaces. Parents were often approached with promises of financial support, future opportunities, and structured career paths for their children. In many cases, families did not fully understand how demanding or consuming the entertainment industry could become once a child entered it. For Anissa, these early steps into modeling marked the beginning of a path that quickly moved from occasional work into something much larger. What started as small appearances would soon lead her into one of the most recognizable child roles on television. The attention she received early on would soon shift her entire life in a direction no one in her family could fully predict. The audition that changed everything. In 1966, everything changed for Anissa Jones when she auditioned for the CBS sitcom Family Affair. The show was being developed as a family-friendly comedy built around an unusual setup, a bachelor suddenly becoming responsible for 3 children. One of those children was Buffy, a young girl who needed to feel believable, warm, and emotionally real on screen. Casting directors knew this role had to work perfectly because the success of the entire show depended on the children feeling authentic to viewers. The audition process for Family Affair was competitive. Many child actors from across Los Angeles were brought in to read for the role. At the time, Hollywood had no shortage of children trying to break into television. Agents were constantly submitting headshots and scheduling auditions for kids who had already done commercials or small acting jobs. The production team saw dozens of young girls who could technically say their lines, but that was not enough for what they were looking for. Anissa stood out during this process for reasons that were not just about appearance. She had a natural way of expressing emotion that did not feel rehearsed. When she delivered her lines, she seemed calm, clear, and believable without forcing anything. Casting directors often look for children who do not appear to be acting, and Anissa had that quality. Her expressions felt real, and her timing matched the tone the producers wanted for Buffy. Her look also fit what television networks of that era considered ideal. She had a clean, simple, all-American appearance that matched the image CBS wanted for a wholesome family show. This was not just about beauty, but about how easily audiences could accept her as a believable child in a traditional household setting. In the 1960s, television networks were very focused on creating characters that felt safe and familiar to mainstream audiences. Once she was selected, approval came quickly. The network and producers did not hesitate for long after seeing her performance. There was a strong expectation that Family Affair would become a major part of CBS's programming lineup, and casting decisions were made with urgency. When Anissa was chosen, it marked the beginning of a rapid transition from everyday child life to national television visibility. After landing the role, her life changed almost immediately. She moved into a professional routine that included regular filming schedules, script readings, costume fittings, and publicity sessions. The structure of her contract reflected industry standards of that time, which did not offer the same level of protection for child actors that exists today. While there were legal guardianship requirements, the day-to-day control over working hours, education, and environment was largely shaped by the studio and production needs. Filming for Family Affair took place on a weekly schedule, and this consistency meant that Anissa's time quickly became organized around the studio. Long hours on set became normal, and her availability was often dictated by production demands. Even though she was still a child, she was now part of a professional system that required discipline and repetition. One of the biggest changes in her life was the loss of a normal school and social environment. Instead of spending full days in a classroom with other children, her education was adjusted around filming. Tutoring or on-set schooling replaced regular attendance, and her interactions with peers outside the industry became limited. Most of her daily time was spent with adults working in television production, rather than with children her own age. This shift created a clear divide between her real childhood and her working life. While she was still growing up, her world had already become centered around scripts, cameras, and studio schedules. The role of Buffy was no longer just a job. It had become the structure around which her entire childhood was being organized. What began as a single audition quickly turned into a life defined by television, routine, and expectations far beyond her years, becoming Buffy. Once Anissa Jones became part of Family Affair, her identity on screen quickly became larger than her real life. She was cast as Buffy, one of 3 orphan children taken in by a wealthy bachelor. The character was designed to fit a very specific idea that television audiences of the 1960s expected: a well-behaved, loving, and emotionally gentle child who could bring warmth into every scene. Buffy was written as the perfect orphan child, someone who could show innocence without conflict and affection without resistance. The writers of Family Affair shaped Buffy carefully to fit this image. Her lines were simple and direct, and her reactions were often emotionally idealized. She rarely showed anger in a deep or lasting way, and when problems came up in the story, they were usually resolved quickly with kindness or understanding. This made Buffy easy for audiences to accept and admire, but it also meant that Anissa had to perform a version of childhood that was tightly controlled and emotionally limited. To match this character, Anissa's appearance was also carefully maintained. Her clothing was selected to reflect a neat, traditional image of a young girl from a stable home. Her hairstyle was always kept tidy, often styled in a way that became instantly recognizable to viewers. Over time, these visual choices became part of her identity in the public eye. She was not just Anissa Jones anymore, she was Buffy, the TV daughter that audiences saw every week. As the show gained popularity, the line between Anissa and Buffy began to blur. Many viewers did not separate the actress from the character. To them, she was Buffy in real life as well. This kind of public perception placed a heavy burden on her because it meant she was constantly associated with a fictional identity that she had to maintain even outside of filming. On set, there were expectations about behavior that went beyond acting. She was expected to remain calm, polite, and consistent with the image of Buffy at all times. Even during breaks, her behavior was often guided by adults who worked on the show. Public appearances, interviews, and photo sessions were also carefully managed. She was presented in a controlled way, with limited freedom to express herself outside of what fit the show's image. Interactions with the press and fans were also structured. Interviews were often supervised, and her responses were kept simple and appropriate for her character's image. She was rarely allowed to speak freely in a way that might separate her personal thoughts from Buffy's personality. This created a situation where even public communication reinforced the idea that she was the same person as the character she played. At the same time, her access to normal childhood experiences became more limited. Long filming hours and studio commitments meant she spent most of her time with adults and production staff. Opportunities to spend time with children her own age were reduced, and everyday experiences like school friendships or neighborhood activities became less common. Her world became centered around the set and the routine of production. Over time, small signs of discomfort began to appear. Being always Buffy meant there was little room for her to develop a separate identity in the eyes of others. Even when she was not filming, people treated her as the character. This created a quiet but growing sense of frustration, as the boundaries between her real self and her television role became harder to maintain. She was still a child, but her life was already shaped by a public image that did not leave much space for change or personal growth. What she was becoming on screen was starting to follow her everywhere she went. Life inside the machine. Life on the set of Family Affair was not just about acting for Anissa Jones. It became a full system that shaped her daily routine, her education, her money, and even how she was seen by the public. From the outside, it looked like a successful child star experience. But inside that system, there was constant pressure that slowly built over time. Filming schedules were demanding. Even though there were child labor laws meant to protect young actors, they were often flexible in practice during that era. Long days on set were common, especially when episodes had tight production deadlines. Scenes were repeated many times until they matched the director's expectations, and this meant Anissa had to stay focused for hours at a time. For a child, this kind of routine left very little space for rest or normal play. Her education also took a different path compared to most children. Instead of attending school full-time, she received on-set tutoring. While this allowed her to continue learning, it was not the same as a regular classroom experience. Lessons were often interrupted by filming needs, and the structure of a normal school environment was missing. Over time, this created gaps in her academic development and limited her exposure to the social side of school life, such as friendships and group activities. Outside of filming, many aspects of her life were managed by adults connected to the show. Public appearances, interviews, and even promotional events were arranged by the studio. Decisions about where she would go, what she would say, and how she would present herself were often made in advance. This meant she had very little control over how she was seen by the public, even though she was the face of one of CBS's popular shows. Money was also handled in a controlled way. As with many child actors at the time, her earnings were placed under financial arrangements managed by her parents or guardians. Trust funds were commonly used to protect child actors' income until they reached adulthood. While this was meant to secure her future, it also meant she had no direct access to her own earnings during her childhood years. As the show continued, there was an increasing gap between Anissa's real personality and the character she played. Buffy was written as calm, gentle, and emotionally steady, but Anissa, like any growing child, had her own moods, thoughts, and reactions. Balancing these two identities became more difficult over time, especially when the public expected her to always match the character. Some co-stars and people who worked on the show later noted changes in her mood as the years went on. She was still professional and capable of performing her role, but there were moments when she seemed more withdrawn or tired. This kind of emotional shift is not unusual for children working under constant pressure, especially when their lives are highly structured and closely monitored. One of the biggest challenges was her limited control over her own image and future. She could not choose how she was marketed, what kind of interviews she gave, or even how her character might develop in a meaningful way. Most of these decisions were made by producers and adults who were focused on the success of the show rather than her personal growth. Even though she continued to perform well on screen, the effort required to maintain Buffy's image took a toll. The separation between her public role and her private feelings became harder to manage. What viewers saw as a cheerful and stable child was often the result of pushing through long hours and emotional fatigue behind the scenes. On camera, everything still looked smooth and consistent, but behind that performance was a growing weight that she carried quietly. And as Family Affair eventually reached its final years, that structure, holding everything together, began to fade. The collapse of childhood. In 1971, Family Affair was canceled, and for Anissa Jones, that moment marked a sudden and major break in her life. The show had been her daily structure for years. It set her schedule, defined her identity in public, and gave her a clear sense of purpose. When it ended, that entire system disappeared almost overnight. The cancellation did not come with a gradual transition. There was no long plan to slowly move the young cast into other roles or new opportunities. One day, she was working regularly on a hit television series, and the next, she was no longer needed on set. For a child who had spent most of her formative years inside that environment, the change was abrupt and difficult to adjust to. Unlike adult actors, child stars in that era were rarely given structured support for what came after a show ended. There were no clear programs in place to help them shift into teenage roles or prepare them for a different kind of acting career. Once the show stopped, they were expected to simply move on and find new opportunities on their own, even if their entire identity had been built around a single role. Anissa and her representatives made attempts to continue her acting career, but the transition was not smooth. The entertainment industry had limited space for former child stars entering adolescence. Casting directors often preferred either younger children or fully established teen actors who had not been strongly associated with one long-running character. As a result, she struggled to find roles that matched her experience and public image. This created a difficult situation. She was no longer a child in the eyes of casting directors, but she was also not yet established as a new type of performer. The role of Buffy had been so recognizable that it made it hard for the industry to see her in a different way. This type of typecasting was common for child actors, and it often limited their future opportunities. As acting roles became harder to find, her public visibility also began to fade. Without a weekly television presence, audiences gradually stopped seeing her. The attention she once received from fans, media, and industry professionals started to decrease. Along with that came a loss of income, which added another layer of pressure to her situation. The psychological impact of this sudden change was significant. Going from being regularly seen and recognized to becoming mostly unknown in a short period can be difficult for anyone, especially a young person who had grown up in that environment. The sense of being discarded by the industry was something many former child actors have described, and Anissa was no exception to that pattern. Without the structure of filming and professional routines, her daily life also changed. She began spending more time outside of Hollywood circles, where the support systems she once had were no longer present. Instead, she became more dependent on friendships and social groups that were less stable and less connected to her earlier life in the industry. These new environments were very different from the controlled and structured world she had known on set. While they offered freedom, they did not provide the same level of guidance or stability. This shift made her transition into adolescence more complicated, as she was still adjusting to life without the identity she had held for most of her childhood. What had once been a carefully managed career was now fading into memory, leaving her to rebuild her life in a world that no longer saw her as Buffy. Life after fame. After Family Affair ended and the attention faded, Anissa Jones entered a very different stage of life. She was no longer a working child star, and she had to adjust to a normal routine that felt unfamiliar after years in television production. One of the first major changes was returning to regular schooling. Instead of on-set tutoring and structured filming days, she was now placed in a traditional school environment with other teenagers. This adjustment was not easy. She had spent most of her childhood in a controlled, adult-centered environment, so everyday school life felt different and sometimes overwhelming. Social dynamics among teenagers can already be challenging, and for someone who had been widely recognized on television, it added another layer of difficulty. Some people knew who she was, while others treated her as just another student. This uneven attention made it harder for her to feel settled or fully understood. At home, tensions also began to increase. As she grew older, she became more independent and less willing to follow strict guidance from her parents. This is a common part of adolescence, but in her case, it was intensified by her unusual upbringing. She had spent years under adult control in a professional setting, and now she was trying to figure out who she was outside of that system. This led to growing rebellion against parental authority and more frequent disagreements about her choices and lifestyle. During the early 1970s, California was also going through a major cultural shift. Many young people were experimenting with new lifestyles, music scenes, and social groups. Unfortunately, this environment also included widespread drug use, and Anissa was exposed to it through friends and social circles outside of her earlier Hollywood connections. These experiences were part of a larger youth culture at the time, but for someone still adjusting emotionally, it added risk and instability to her life. She also made attempts to step away from her Buffy identity. Being known primarily as a former child star made it difficult for her to be seen as just a regular teenager. In response, she tried to build a new sense of self that was separate from her television past. This is something many former child actors go through as they try to distance themselves from a character that defined their early years. However, reports from people around her suggested that her behavior became increasingly unpredictable over time. There were moments of emotional instability, shifting moods, and difficulty maintaining consistent routines. While these accounts vary, they reflect a broader pattern of struggle during this period of her life. The combination of lost structure, changing social environments, and personal pressure made stability harder to maintain. As her distance from her family's earlier structured life grew, she became more disconnected from the environment she once knew. The support system that had been present during her childhood career was no longer as strong or consistent. This left her more isolated as she moved further away from the world of television and public attention. Another challenge was the fact that her past fame still followed her in certain spaces. Even though she was no longer actively working in Hollywood, people still recognized her. This made her vulnerable to being treated differently or approached in ways that were not always supportive. Former child stars often experience this kind of attention imbalance, where their past fame creates expectations or curiosity that can lead to exploitation or unhealthy relationships. By this stage, her life had shifted far away from the structured environment of family affair. She was trying to live as a normal young adult, but without the same stability, guidance, or identity that had once defined her. And as her world continued to shrink away from fame, her personal struggles became harder to hide. In the final months of Anissa Jones' life, her situation became increasingly unstable and difficult to manage. She was no longer connected to the structured world she had grown up in during family affair, and her day-to-day life lacked consistency or stability. Reports from people around her describe a period marked by frequent changes in living arrangements, where she did not have a steady or secure home environment. This kind of instability made it harder for her to maintain any sense of routine or long-term support. During this time, her struggles with substance use also became more serious. What may have started earlier as experimentation or social exposure developed into deeper patterns of dependency. Substances such as alcohol and prescription drugs, including barbiturates, became part of her life in ways that increased risk and reduced her ability to cope with emotional stress. This combination is especially dangerous because it affects both physical health and decision-making. As her personal life became more chaotic, she also began to withdraw from family members and people who had known her earlier in life. This separation was not sudden, but it gradually increased over time. Communication with family and former acquaintances became less frequent, and emotional distance grew wider. For someone who had once been part of a tightly managed and public career, this isolation marked a major shift in her support system. There were also signs that she was struggling emotionally. People who knew her during this period described moments that suggested depression and self-destructive behavior. While the full details of her mental state are not completely documented, the overall picture points to someone who was dealing with significant internal distress. Without consistent emotional or psychological support, these struggles became harder to manage. Access to medical or psychological care was limited and not stable enough to provide long-term help. During the 1970s, mental health awareness and support systems for young adults, especially former child actors, were not as developed as they are today. This meant that even when signs of distress were visible, there were fewer structured ways to intervene or provide ongoing treatment. By this point, Hollywood was no longer part of her life in any meaningful way. The industry that had once brought her fame and recognition was completely absent during her struggles. There was no continued involvement, no support system from the entertainment world, and no public attention focused on her circumstances. The connection between her early fame and her later life had largely faded in the eyes of the industry. In 1976, at just 18 years old, Anissa Jones died. Her death was ruled as mixed drug intoxication involving barbiturates and alcohol. This combination is known to be particularly dangerous as it can severely depress the central nervous system. Her passing occurred in a private setting, away from public view, marking a quiet and tragic end to a life that had once been widely recognized on television. If this story made you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss more real-life Hollywood stories like this.